David Blankenhorn was smart enough to reach out to Bill Doherty, who'd been a longtime friend and collaborator with him, just to say, Bill, what do you think about this idea? The simple version of it is that Bill just said, okay, let me get involved in this because otherwise this could go
Poorly.
wrong. Yeah, exactly. And so it was one of his most sort of anxiety-inducing projects. And this is a person who's a master of crafting space for empathy. But he did it, and the event was so powerful that he had a dozen or so people on each side came into the conversation very much suspicious of each other, came away from it just sort of loving each other across the divisions. You had two individuals who started a fairly famous friendship from that. Fellow named Greg Smith, former small town sheriff, construction worker, evangelical Christian, just voted for Trump, and Kuyar Mustashvi, Iranian immigrant, leader of the local Democratic Central Committee, and just voted for Hillary Clinton. And there was a moment in that first workshop where Greg wanted to ask Kuyar a question, and he approached him and he said, well, actually, I guess he was delivering a statement. He said, I can tell you, he said, my problem with Islam in 4 letters, I, and before he got to that last letter, Kuyar gently interrupted him. He said, my friend, I know what you're going to say. He said, but my religion has been hijacked by people who don't share my values. He said, can't you think of people in your religion who may have hijacked your religion too? And Greg, stepped back and thought about it, people burning crosses on the lawns of, black folks in the name of Jesus Christ, and realized, well, yeah, I absolutely can think of people who've hijacked my religion. So at the end of the gathering, Greg and Kuyar stood up and formed the group that they'd made a promise to each other. They were going to work together to bring people together across these divides. Kuyar was going to pay a visit to Greg's evangelical church, and Greg was going to pay a visit to a service at Kuyar's mosque. And so, this was one of many inspiring stories that came out of that first workshop.
This week on Forward, National Ambassador for the largest grassroots depolarization organization in the country, Braver Angels, John Wood Jr. This week on Forward. It's my pleasure to welcome to Forward the National Ambassador for Braver Angels, John Wood Jr. Welcome, John.
Andrew. It's so great to be able to see you in person, man. This has been a minute coming. I'm really happy about this.
Yeah, been far too long. I'm super excited too. I have to say, you look like a celebrity, but I'm not sure which one. So what do you get, my friend?
Oh man. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what I get. So particularly when I had my hair sort of faded down, I got Tiger Woods. And if I had a baseball cap on, people would actually, at airports, stand in front of me. So if I had the facial hair shaved, hair faded down, cap on, people would come from behind me and stand in front of me and look right in my face to be able to tell themselves that I wasn't Tiger Woods. And when people found out my last name was Wood, then, it made it even worse. People like, oh, you got to be related and whatnot. And just, one of my pet peeves is people putting an S on the end of my name. It happens about 50% of the time, even to this day, So the Tiger Woods Association has been a consistent one.
I can see it with a cap on. And you have a similar athletic physique too. Like the same build.
I'll take that as a compliment. A Tiger's great. The other thing I get more recently is I can't remember the name of the character or the actor, but the dude from Bridgerton.
Wow, that's a compliment because he's a very handsome man.
Oh yeah. Oh, well, I definitely take that one as a compliment. All I need
You're happily married though, bro.
But all I need is But all I need is a dinner jacket and a horse, and I'm
British accent too. You gotta have that
accent, too. Helps, but Yeah.
Oh, so I'm a huge fan of Braver Angels, which is the largest grassroots depolarization organization in the country. And I think you actually go and lead these sessions and workshops where you take people and you try to make them less partisan, less in their own ideological corner. So tell me about the work that you do? Like, let's say, like, what's the number of people in the gathering? Like, how is it structured?
Right. Definitely. Okay, so let me give you the layout. And I do have experience organizing workshops. My own primary function within the organization is sort of as a general strategist for the organization, broadly speaking, and of course, making the public case, the media case, and so forth for not just the work that we do with respect to the methodologies, but for the larger narrative and philosophy of American politics that we seek for our work to sort of sync up with, right? Which I think makes
It's
meets
a really good fit with Forward. I mean, it's nuts.
that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think what we represent in terms of the shift in the cultural paradigm of politics lines up very nicely with where you're coming from. But to answer your question, we have a wide range of workshops and programs, to say nothing of our live events, media content, and various other things. So I'll give you a sense of kind of the spectrum of activities. We have something called a depolarizing within workshop, which is basically taking a group of folks, and it could be, a dozen, it could be 4 dozen or so, and putting them through outlining guided exercises for them that allow them to sort of monitor their internal dialogue, learning to sort of check themselves when they have a thought about somebody from the other side, immediately jumping to the sort of assumption that this person is, a racist, or this person is, a dirtbag commie or something, and sort of giving them kind of the mental sort of architecture to affix a more nuanced understanding of who the human being is likely to be on the other side of an opinion. So that's about sort of internal mindfulness, if you will, with respect to polarization.
Okay, so let's say an organization says, I sense that there's something amiss within my class, within my company, or whatnot. Do they call you guys up?
Oh, yeah.
That is awesome. Okay,
Sure.
so that's one is structured workshops. Continue.
Right. Another we have is called Skills for Bridging the Divide. Skills for Bridging the Divide. And this is specifically about instructing people in rhetorical and communicative techniques for being able to have the difficult conversations, right? And so you learn the importance of I statements, being willing to lean into your subjectivity as a way of demonstrating humility. So most of us will say like, oh, it's just a fact that Obama was the best president for healthcare, or it's like, oh, it's obvious that Trump was the best president for the economy. And, theoretically or hypothetically, either of those things could be true, but when you just put it out there as like, I'm obviously right about this, you put the other person in the defensive. So if you say, well, in my experience, Obama's policies really made a difference,
etc.
Right, exactly. Suddenly you're inviting people to a conversation. Also, the importance of paraphrasing, being able to articulate the other person's point of view in terms that they themselves would resonate with as an accurate expression of what they believe, as opposed to just characterizing, say, somebody who's pro-life and saying, oh, you just don't think women should have a right to their bodies. Probably not how that person thinks about themselves. But if you say something along the lines of, okay, the life of the unborn is sacred to you, and that's why this position matters for you, then they at least can say, okay, I know you probably don't agree with me, but thank you for, you're clearly hearing what I'm saying, right? So we have things like that. Our most famous workshop, the one that sort of started the organization originally, is something called a red-blue workshop. This is something that is based off of principles of family therapy. It's essentially marriage counseling for Republicans and Democrats. Designed by Professor Bill Doherty, who's co-founder of Braver Angels, the University of Minnesota, a very prominent family therapist, incredibly wise man.
So cool that there's like a family therapist
deeply
who'd been mediated all of these relationships, because there's a sense,
Yeah.
and I've been saying this to folks, that Democrats are like the mom party and Republicans are like the dad party. So it takes a family therapist to try and mend the fence. But so how did that workshop get started?
I think you're right about that. Well, the way that got started is the origin story of the organization itself.
And what year was this?
This was 2016, a month after the election. So this
that was a time for a lot of people. Like, I mean, for me, right after Trump won, I was like, what am I going to do? It's like, I'm going to prepare to run for president. So
no, exactly. Yeah. No, look, we all, one way or the other, we saw what was going on in America. People like you, people like me and other folks, and said, okay, time for reasonable people to try and get involved. So the founders of the organization, David Blankenhorn, formerly president of the Institute for American Values, Bill Doherty, who I just mentioned, and also my colleague and friend David Lapp, scholar and activist in South Lebanon, Michigan. Well, David and David had a conversation after the election comparing how people were reacting in their own parts of the country. Blankenhorn is from Mississippi originally, but he lives here in New York, and was just basically saying people here are distraught. People here are, are losing it. Whereas David Lapp in Ohio, he said, well, in the time, place I'm at, he said, people are over the moon. He said, most people just couldn't be happier, can't believe how great this is. And so they asked themselves the question, they said, people are bitterly divided. Is it possible that Americans can still find common ground and connect? Maybe we should run an experiment and find out. And so they had this idea to go to a town, to a place in Ohio, South Lebanon, Ohio, a community that had literally just voted 50-50 for Trump and Clinton. And they decided to put together just sort of a conversation over the course of, a day or two, bring people together and see if they could sort of hear each other out and understand why they came away voting the way that they did. And problem is that David and David are not, program designers, scholars and intellectuals and so forth. And so David just figured they'd throw a bunch of people into a room together and see what happened.
Talk.
Right. But, David Blankenhorn was smart enough to reach out to Bill Doherty, who'd been a longtime friend and collaborator with him, just to say, Bill, what do you think about this idea? And Bill said, Jesus Christ, this is going to be a disaster. Got to take people who've just come through sort of a universally traumatic, sort of experience and throw them in a room together. This has to have some structure and some design. And, the simple version of it is that Bill just said, okay, let me get involved in this because otherwise this could go
poorly.
Wrong. Yeah, exactly. And so, it was one of his most sort of anxiety inducing projects. And this is a person who's a master of crafting space for empathy. And dialogue, but he did it, and the event was so powerful that he had a dozen or so people on each side came into the conversation very much suspicious of each other, came away from it just sort of loving each other across the divisions, realizing they had deep common interests, deep common commitments to their community. You had two individuals who started a fairly famous friendship from that. Fellow named Greg Smith, former small town sheriff, construction worker, evangelical Christian, just voted for Trump, and Kuyar Mustashfi, Iranian immigrant, leader of the local Democratic Central Committee, and just voted for Hillary Clinton. And there was a moment in that first workshop, and I wasn't there, but this is in the lore, of Braver Angels, where Greg wanted to ask Kuyar a question, and he approached him and he said, well, actually, I guess he was delivering a statement. He said, I can tell you, he said, my problem with Islam in 4 letters, I, and before he got to that last letter, Kuyar sort of, gently interrupted him. He said, my friend, I know what you're going to say. He said, but my religion has been hijacked by people who don't share my values. He said, can't you think of people in your religion who may have hijacked your religion too? And Greg, stepped back and thought about it, people burning crosses on the lawns of, black folks in the name of Jesus Christ, and realized, well, yeah, I absolutely can think of people who've hijacked my religion. So at the end of the gathering, Greg and Kuyar stood up and formed the group that they'd made a promise to each other. Kuyar, they were going to work together to bring people together across these divides. Kuyar was going to pay a visit to Greg's evangelical church, and Greg was going to pay a visit to a service at Kuyar's mosque. And so, this was one of many inspiring stories that came out of that first workshop. And what happened after that, as I understand it, is that the show basically went on the road. They commissioned a bus, David and Bill, a small crew, which included my colleague Kieran O'Connor, who I think you know, and April Lawson, who's become a huge part of the organization, at the heart of the organization since then, was working as a journalist for David Brooks at the New York Times. She embedded on the bus. And basically NPR picked up the story, and the word got out as to what this group of people were doing. They went from Philadelphia to Tennessee, I believe, just up and down,
So at that time, Braver Angels was
Eastern
called Better
states.
Angels. Was it called Better Angels during the bus tour? They didn't have a name yet?
I think that it did become Better Angels during the bus tour.
Better Angels bus tour.
Better Angels bus tour. That's right. And so they became sort of first responders for communities suffering from polarization. People would call them and say, hey,
We're gonna
we
need a
can't.
big bus.
Exactly. We can't, function in our PTA meetings. Our neighborhood is tearing itself apart. Can you come by and help us? But at each stop, they were not just holding the workshops, but training volunteers to be able to do the workshops themselves after they left, right? And so
Incredible.
that became the beginning, not just of our, larger reputation, but of our volunteer and membership base as well. And so all that happened over the course of the summer of 2017 before I even got to the organization or had heard of it. So yeah, that's the origin story of what at the time was Better Angels.
It's 2022 and you like to personalize just about everything in your life, and yet you drink the same cup of coffee every morning, even though it's gotten a little bit stale. You don't know where it's sourced. Why buy the same old, same old? Instead, get a coffee that you know you're going to love because it's made for you. Take the coffee quiz to get started. Trade Coffee will source from America's best independent roasters ethically, so it'll taste great and you'll feel great about it. They guarantee you'll love your first bag or they will replace it for free. Trade has been featured by the New York Times, Wired, GQ, and has delivered over 5 million bags of coffee. Why not to you? For our listeners right now, Trade Coffee is offering a total of $20 off your first 3 bags when you go to drinktrade.com/yang. To get started, take their quiz at drinktrade.com/yang and start your journey to your perfect cup. That's drinktrade.com/yang for $20 off your first 3 bags. So was this during the time that you were running for Congress? Is that right?
No. I actually had run for Congress in 2014. Yeah, so in 2014.
You were so young then, man, because you're young now.
Yeah, I was really young then. 2014. Yeah, man. I was the youngest active nominee for Congress in the state of California. I ran against Maxine Waters in that.
At the age of
election
21,
cycle.
is that right?
A little older than that, but I would have been 26. I think I was 27 on election day. Yeah, but I started campaigning when I was about 26 or so, early in 2013. Nobody knew me. Nobody knew a damn thing about me. I had zero reputation, zero resume. But I was somebody who had.
So that's a very bold move to run for Congress.
I know you can't
in
relate.
your mid
You
late
can't
20s.
relate.
Can't relate to boldness like that. Wait your turn, young John. No. So, what pushed you in that direction? And I know you have something of like I want to say, like music in your family. You're apparently a very talented performer yourself.
Thanks, sir.
And I think that one of that there's like this strange overlap between certain forms of performance. Let's call it actor, musician, comedian, like just standing in front of a stage and trying to create an experience for a group of people, and then politician. So was there like a performance arc for you when you were young? Because it's highly unusual, obviously, to run for Congress in your mid to late 20s.
You're the only person who's ever interviewed me who immediately made that connection. So I grew up in a musical family, and the cultural sort of connection of my family that was made possible through music had everything to do with sort of what served as the backdrop for my candidacy. So when I was running for Congress, people would ask me.
And this was in LA.
This was in Los Angeles, right? Yeah.
Which is where you grew up as well.
That's correct. Yeah, I grew up in Los Angeles. And, whether I was speaking to a Democratic-leaning black church in South Central Los Angeles or to a, white Tea Party club in South Bay, LA County, people would ask me, they'd say, well, at the age of 26, what on earth makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I would tell people, well, I come from an interesting family background. My mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother to my father to my mother, and that's why I can represent all of you. And so, that always serve for a laugh and to sort of contextualize my message.
You lived Braver Angels. That's
Yeah.
why you're the national ambassador today. Sorry, continue.
Well, but my parents met through music, really. My father's a jazz pianist. My mother's an R&B singer. She danced on Soul Train, back in the late 70s, early 80s. They met in my grandfather's recording studio. My dad was running it as an engineer. But my grandfather owned the biggest independent record label in America in the late 50s and was still president of it in the early 60s. Dot Records, which had 36 million sellers, was Pat Boone's record label, along with Lawrence Welk and Billy Vaughn, Del Vikings, Gail Storm, folks like that. And before that, Grandpa started the first radio show in America, sponsored by a mail order record shop he owned of the same name, that broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music, basically black music, to a national audience. So Grandpa was a white man, but he had a deep love for black culture and black music. And so that signal traveled clear across the South. It launched the careers of Mahalia Jackson, Arthur Alexander, Fats Domino, who loved my grandfather very much. Solomon Burke did also. Bob Marley recorded his early hits at a recording studio called Randy's. On a clear night, the signal would travel from WLAC in Nashville all the way into Jamaica and the islands. And so it was heard there too. And so Marley recorded some of his early hits in a studio named after the radio show and indirectly after my grandfather. So I grew up as a singer, as a trumpet player, even as something of a rapper. And the truth is I never made a career out of it, but I was surrounded by professional musicians and artists. On my mother's side, one of my uncles is Mac 10 of the West Side Connection, which was Ice Cube's group after he left NWA and so forth. We got, artists in every direction. But as a jazz player, the focus is on improvisation. And I always had a process. I was playing on bandstands at the age of 12 and whatnot with my dad and his band and my little brother. And I always had a process where, when my solo was coming up, I would sort of hear the changes, in the music, feel the chords with the piano, rhythm of the bass and so forth. And I would sort of imagine my solo inside of myself, before I played it. And I would sort of imagine it and feel how it was going to make the people in the audience feel. And then I would get up and I would just play what was on the inside. People frequently ask me, they say, man, how long does it take you to write a speech? I was able to run that campaign for Congress in part just because I was a better speaker than anybody else, better on a stage. And my answer to that question is that I never write speeches.
If you write a speech, there's a tip for anyone out there. Mm-hmm. Let's say you have a speech to give.
Yeah.
Here's a list of things not to do. So the worst speech you can give is a speech that you've written ahead of time that you deliver word for word.
Right.
It's very, very hard for that to be a good speech.
Yeah.
So to your point, if you haven't prepared something, obviously you get rid of that as a pitfall.
Well, yes, but your point is relevant because, I do think that people who write good speeches have an outline, they have an essential structure, but ultimately, they're able to preserve some spontaneity in the delivery.
They feel alive. They feel actually like they're speaking to you as opposed to reciting.
I mean, think of if you were going on a date. Think of you're taking someone out. You're trying to establish a connection, right? I mean, you might have something of sort of a game plan going into it.
I mean, I never did.
Well, me neither, actually. But but point being that if you're like reading from a script, if you got some obvious sort of formula and so forth, there's not gonna be any connection there because you're not feeling anything. You're leaning on.
This is something I really struggled with on the presidential, man, because you'd hear these stump speeches over and over again from these candidates. They weren't quite word for word, but they were close, and they were just such performances, and not even great performances a lot of the time. You know what I mean?
Right.
So continue. I can imagine 26-year-old you holding your own just because you were a better speaker, like had more presence, seemed more composed, better thought out.
And I had deeply studied, not just issues in politics, but philosophy, religion, history. And it's funny because I was a shit student, Andrew, to tell you the truth. I actually almost dropped out of high school. Another thing that people assume about me, because I speak at universities across the country, I work with, sort of elite academics and, psychology and political science and journalists and get to hang out with folks like you. People tend to think that I must be some Ivy League guy, and I've got a little bit of that in my family. But man, to this day, I don't have a college degree, which tends to shock people. And like I said, I mean, I think my GPA graduating high school is like 1.8. I feel like technically.
So
I
what were
have
you
even
doing instead?
crossed the
Because
stage.
clearly you were doing something. Was it music? Was it sports? Was
I,
it girls? Was
I
it hanging out?
was
Like, what was it?
I wish it was girls. It was not. No. I wanted it to be girls at the time. I was studying. I was reading. I was just studying and reading the things that I wanted to study and
Wow.
read
You
in
were
the time
actually
that I
like
wanted
genuinely
to.
intellectually
Yeah.
inquisitive, and you're like, oh, this is science stuff, pass. And then you just went off and read something
Well,
else.
yeah. I mean, and I'm not necessarily advising that for people who've got, students and kids at home who they, I mean, I'm saying that good grades aren't important and so forth, but, it really was exceedingly difficult for me to sort of fit into the regimentation of, the school environment. And yet I loved studying. I buried myself in books constantly. And would just look at my assigned homework and be like, yeah, and would just keep reading, whatever it was, autobiography
Herman
of Malcolm
Hesse,
X,
yeah, whatever it was.
David Copperfield, Charles Dickens, Lord of the Rings. But I would write too. I mean, I was constantly writing stories. I would write essays for myself sometimes. Now, part of the reason I was like that was because my parents did divorce when I was fairly young, and living in my father's house was he raised us in a time capsule. It's a whole other subject, but my dad has deep sort of, antipathy towards a lot of modern technology and modern popular culture. And so I grew up sort of only being able, at least in my dad's house, to watch old movies. I grew up on music from the 50s and 60s.
You do have this
Humphrey
old
Bogart
school
films, Cary Grant
energy. You're like a classic. And then the jazz
well,
musician, and
yeah.
then the steeped in Cary Grant films, it sounds like.
There's a reason for that. The Rat Pack and so on and so forth. Yes, because I wasn't allowed to play video games, at least in my dad's house. My aunt, this is a terrible story, but my aunt got me a Mac, an iMac, when it first came out. I think it was in 7th grade or something. My dad took it, sold it, and bought a Selectric 3 typewriter for me instead. And so, but all of that did sort of force me to be deeply acquainted with certain subjects and parts of America's cultural and social sort of history and past, which ironically gave me a clear pathway towards sort of understanding many older Americans. And
Yeah, I can see that. I can see how you'd be able to click with them. So
and I guess it influenced my larger presentation as well, perhaps.
So you're a poor high school student, and then you try out college, and it's also not a fit.
I think I probably spent the better part of 7 inconsistent years trying to get through community college. Never. I think I'm probably 6 credits away from a degree. But if I got it from my associates, but if I got it now, it would mess up my whole story.
Yeah, no, it's not
wouldn't be
very productive.
It wouldn't be worth it at this point. No.
So what then? So you're an indifferent community college student.
Yeah.
How do you go from your early 20s to running for Congress? Like, what does that time look like?
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. I'll speed through it. But I worked for Barack Obama's campaign in 2008. I'll tell you, I was an activist in high school. I gave my first public speech opposing the Iraq War at the Culver City City Council meeting. Yeah, at the Culver City City Council meeting, where the City Council ultimately approved a resolution in opposition to the war. And but when George W. Bush was reelected in 2004, I grew up very much considering myself to be sort of a liberal Democrat. And when he was reelected, I just thought, okay, system doesn't work. All my hard work was for nothing. I was jaded at the age of 17. I was 5 days.
Interesting.
I was 5 days too young to vote. Birthday is November 9th. And So without ever having been able to vote, I wiped my hands of politics and I said, I'm done because, privileged suburban, millennial kid, thinking like he'd suffered too much to, continue the fight. And so, and I might have stayed done if it weren't for the fact that my progressive aunt called me, my father's sister. My father is, at this point, pretty conservative. His sister is very left leaning. My mother's more liberal. Her brother is very conservative. So, in all directions. And she told me, she said, there's this young guy. She said, he's a senator from Illinois. She said, this was actually in 2004. She said, he just spoke at the Democratic convention. She said, he's amazing. I think he could be our our first black president. And she was like, have you seen him? I was like, no, who are you talking about? She was like, his name is funny. I don't know how to pronounce it. She said, I think it's Barack Obama. And when she said, I was like, Baracko. I was like, how are you going to get to be president with a name like Baracko, But when I checked him out, I sort of, heard his story, his family, his white mother from Kansas, father from Kenya, sort of.
I can see why this would key in for you.
Well, and his deep emphasis on sort of humanizing the fuller spectrum of identities in American life. And I was taken with that. I was like, sure, this guy is really speaking like to the heart of, what I believe. And so I threw myself into Obama's campaign just as sort of a foot soldier, canvasser, and just talking people's ears off about hope and change. After he was elected, I sort of committed to myself that in whatever way I could, I wanted to advance this cultural movement, which for me was about building towards a post-partisan, post-racial America. I was sick
original
of the hate.
Promise of the Obama 08 campaign. Yes,
exactly. I was sick of the hate. I was sick of the narrow-mindedness. I was sick of people's inability to listen to each other, not just in America broadly speaking, but even in my own family, because I had grown up in the sort of intersection of a lot of the cultural divisions that were becoming more and more visible across the country in many respects. And so a lot of things happened simultaneously. I had made it a point to start studying conservatism and paying much deeper attention to what Republicans were talking about than I had before in an effort to understand conservatives so as to be able to bring them into this fold. At the same time, I had met a woman from a traditional Black Baptist background in inner city LA, married her, experienced something of a religious conversion. I had been very sort of anti-organized religion, but after sort of a series of experiences, reading the Bible from cover to cover, I came away with my own interpretation of it that made it sort of deeply resonant. And we moved to Colorado Springs because she joined the Army. We joined a Messianic synagogue, which I don't know if you're familiar with Messianic Judaism, but it's essentially Judaism that takes on board the idea that Jesus Christ is Messiah, but preserves all of the culture and ceremony and a lot of the larger theological sort of interpretations. And my wife was very enmeshed in that for a time. But suffice it to say that suddenly, I was in a context where all my friends are soldiers and religious people. The community institutions of both the military and faith-based communities were there. I was studying economics in a way I never had before and wound up being impressed by a lot of the arguments. Read Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, cover to cover, Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand, and so forth. Started studying, and this was another key, African-American history from a more conservative vantage point, and developed some skepticism with respect to the impact of the welfare state as it has been constituted, at least, on the interest and the community cohesion of Black and inner city communities, and also came away with a point of view that recognized the fact that the greatest political advancement in terms of civil rights of African Americans in this country had taken place within the 35-year period of American life where you actually had bipartisan representation of the Black community, right? You actually had Black Republicans and Democrats in significant numbers from the New Deal era to the end of the Civil Rights Movement. I did not like the way they were talking on Fox News. I didn't like the tone of Sean Hannity's rhetoric, and I thought there's so much that was divisive and toxic on both sides. And I didn't think of myself as falling in love with the Republican Party, but I suddenly thought of myself as really seeing a lot of deep value in many conservative ideas. And I thought to myself, you know what? And I wasn't too impressed with kind of the Obama administration's economic performance, but I still loved Obama and I still loved his original message. And I thought, you know what, maybe if I were to take on board, sort of an identification with the Republican Party, going to the fact that I agree with a lot of these ideas and sentiments, but still let people know that I'm still coming from the same place as somebody who not only wants to build these bridges, but who has a deep relationship to the Black experience, the inner city experience, the multicultural experience, and who wants to elevate the positive values of those spaces as well. Maybe I could be a bridge for each side to relate to and empathize with the other, Black and white, left and right. And so then it was just a question of how can I go about doing that? And I thought, oh, what the hell, I'll run for Congress. I'm not likely to win, but I'm confident in my abilities, and I think that I can make an impact on how people think, and who knows what that might lead to. And so just so happened when we moved back to Los Angeles that put us in Maxine Waters' district, which meant that I was running against somebody who was formidable, to say the least, in terms of her political machine. But it was an opportunity that I took, and it set the stage for everything that followed.
So after that race, there's like a multi-year period before Braver Angels even forms.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like somehow you were still activated in trying to bring people together, which brought you to Braver Angels several years later.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So the way that worked was in the aftermath of the 2014 election, and so, obviously I lost, but although it's a low bar, I did better than any Democrat or Republican had ever done before me or after me, for that matter. I still have done better running against Maxine Waters than anybody else who's ever challenged her. And I raised all of $10,000 in that race. Others have raised millions and so forth. But I was elected. I was very popular within the GOP in LA and
I would bet, man,
California.
you're like a dream.
Well, as a matter of fact, National Review wrote an article about me called John Wood's California Dream, which was sort of my first introduction to any, bit of national recognition. But I tried to bring a sort of a fraternal spirit to political culture within the institutional Republican Party as it existed in California and Los Angeles. I wanted to move towards a place to where we could compete with Democrats, we would be competitive, but we were also looking for opportunities to engage with them in public conversations, to be able to explore issues together and see if we could maintain competitive fervor while still strengthening relationships between communities. What wound up happening was that I had people who wanted to run me out of town from within the party on the basis of the fact that I was too friendly with the wrong Republicans. Because at that time, there was a deep and bitter, and this was, across much of the party across the country, but certainly in LA and California, there was a deep and bitter sort of, civil war between the more sort of establishment and kind of traditional conservative crowd on the one hand, and the young multicultural Ron Paul wing libertarian crowd on the other hand. And I stepped into this race to, help lead the LA County Party, sort of having been drafted by the more establishment side, but not really knowing how deep the feud was. And so I ran a campaign that was about bringing those sides together.
Yep.
And it worked for me as a candidate for that party office. But afterwards, it was sort of made clear to me that, that's not going to work, as a way of doing business here, And so
one aside, but this is something I'm very certain of.
Mm.
There are really, really talented principled congressional candidates who lose that we don't hear enough from.
Yeah.
I've spoken now, I endorsed a couple dozen at least in 2020, most all of whom lost because I was endorsing folks who were kind of, outsiders or, running in districts that were very unfavorable to them.
You're endorsing people like me, I think.
And some of them, virtually all of them, I thought were really, really impressive humans.
Right.
And I'm going to suggest even that if you decide to run a race that you're likely to lose, that takes like a different type of fortitude and motivation. It's like, this is not a careerist move. This is like a, hey, I'm going to do it because it's the right thing.
It does if you're serious. There are people who run as perennial candidates who just sort of, get addicted to it as, their one way into some semblance of the spotlight. But for people who really commit to making an impact, knowing they're going to lose, it takes believing in something beyond your own advancement.
And they, they think that if everything breaks right, they're going to win, but it's unlikely. Most of them do lose. Right. So I have a friend who is an investor type, and he says he constantly tries to find these people and have them work in nonprofits that he's on the board of, because they're very talented in that regard. One person whose story this reminds me of a little bit is Crystal Ball, who people may or may not remember, but she was a young congressional candidate in a red district, and I think it was Virginia, and lost, and then wound up on MSNBC briefly, and then was cast out for being too independent minded or something like that, and now she's now she's blazing an incredible trail.
I was inspired by her example.
Crystal will be pumped to hear that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've never met her, but yeah.
But they're, you should visit with them. They're great people. Her and Sagar, I think, are some of the best voices on current events today. But it's not just you and Crystal, though. I spoke to so many people who resemble this that I thought, like, wow, this person is incredible, and they could be, running more than, frankly, representing a congressional district. Like, I'd put this person in charge of all sorts of stuff. But our system doesn't really allow for a path forward for a lot of those people, because let's say that you're in the minority party in a district. Let's say you run for Congress and lose. And then what's the next step? It's like, well, you can't just keep running for Congress over and over and losing. And if you're in that community and your party's not in power, then, there's not much of an opportunity for you. So a lot of times you just leave politics altogether, I'm guessing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that tends to be the way of it. You have good people who step in for a moment. They are people who are probably very competent in their own areas of life, their own professions, and so forth.
Very often so, yes.
And very often people who therefore, or at least I would say not unrelated to that, also buy in a little bit less to the tribal sort of narratives around which the party structures
probably also true, yeah,
congeal and derive a lot of their sort of moral authority. And what happens is people experience the toxicity, they experience the ugliness, they find themselves getting pushed into positions.
There are a lot of excellent people who see this stuff too and are like, hard pass, I'm not going to put myself through that.
Well, that's what it is. It's either hard pass and they don't run, or they do run and they get a taste of how nasty it is, how little they're actually in a position to do. And then it's like, why continue with this? And these are some of the people who you really do, in an ideal world,
you wish were actually in
want.
Positions of authority.
Right. So, what I tried to do was, I left I'm still a registered Republican to this day, and happy to be so. And, if you want, we can talk about the larger sort of space there. But I left active sort of, employ with the party, and sought to launch a digital media network that was meant to lift up voices, not left or right, but left and right, voices who would disagree with each other on politics, but who agreed on how we ought to treat each other in politics.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question of what it is called, I can't give you the answer to that question because of how the project ultimately ended. It was sort of stepped on by a multi-billion-dollar, corporation that didn't like the fact that the name of our network was somewhat close to theirs, even though we were dealing with news and information and they were dealing with, baseball caps and basketball jerseys and other things. And so I, wound up sort of feeling like I was at a low point. I'd run for Congress. I had, served as vice chair of the LA County Republican Party, which came with a fair amount of, accolades and some degree of prestige, but it was actually a volunteer position, right? I didn't get paid for any of that. I was juggling multiple part-time jobs with first
you had family support.
First one little kid and then two.
Yep.
living, or we still live, but living in a little apartment in South Los Angeles. And wife very much sort of like, hey John, at a certain point, I know you have this dream of kind of changing the
Political discourse and culture of America
reaching the
and bring people
conscience
together. And
of American democracy. But at a certain point, you're going to have to consider just getting a regular 9 to 5, which I do about as well with regular 9 to 5s as I did in,
high school.
in high school, right? Exactly. But, it was around, so, I had sunk a year of my life into getting this media network going, only to have it kind of snuffed out just as it was starting to get some traction. But then a friend of mine pointed out to me the existence of an organization called Better Angels. Now, the thing is that my concept for a media network was always meant to jump off the screen. The idea was to be able to build up a cross-partisan, cross-cultural following, right? That would
which, by the way, just a brief
yeah.
thing, is kind of what I'm doing now with
Yeah.
Forward, like, this podcast and everything else, where all politics is tribal, and there's this massive tribe that's not spoken to or for.
Right.
And so you were marching at that problem a number of years ago. So continue.
Yes. I mean, at the time, so I had this idea. I'd taken some inspiration from the Rubin Report and his success. I mean, Dave Rubin at that time, he's not quite this way now. And I like Dave, and I consider Dave a friend. I've gotten to know him a little bit. But in those years, Dave was really sort of brokering kind of, heterodox conversations from across the spectrum in ways that really seemed to be bringing the best out of people who you knew, politically speaking, were worlds apart. And so there were some examples of this in different spaces, but I just thought that there was a way to sort of model that culture and then scale it out in a manner that would allow it to translate to direct sort of social mobilization on the ground around not just sort of like political projects, but possibly community development sort of activities and various other fronts. When people come together in a creative and entrepreneurial spirit, there's no limit to what they can do to solve real world problems. And so I had this idea, and I looked at Better Angels, and they were already having the sorts of relationship building conversations and events in local communities that I had thought a media network structure could kind of build towards.
Lead to, yeah,
exactly.
Totally.
But, their website was kind of like, text heavy and pixelated. They had a Facebook page that sort of was abandoned, a YouTube channel with a couple of nice clips, but nothing else going on. And so I just thought to myself, well, maybe there's room for my media network idea within this organization. It was a long shot, but I drove down to San Diego, sat in on a workshop with my pal Luke Phillips, who I think you may also know. My buddy looks like Pete Buttigieg and is now a longstanding Braver Angels volunteer, scholar, historian, young guy. And presented my media network idea to David Blankenhorn, who was at that workshop. And so was Bill Doherty. He ran the workshop. Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary was there too, playing the guitar and singing. David was thrilled with the idea. Ultimately, I was hired to build out the media network for Better Angels. Still wound up being faced with a lot of the limitations I had before. We didn't really have any money for it. It wasn't really my competence. I had the vision, but I didn't really have, much experience of any kind of production media. But I was brought on board to build out the media network structure. David committed to me from the very beginning. He wanted Better Angels to be a platform for me as a public intellectual and a public voice, as a writer and so forth on issues of race and polarization. And I very quickly just became sort of a general kind of spokesperson and then national ambassador, as well as a larger sort of strategist, because I had community organizing experience and various other things. I very quickly became a spokesperson and strategist for the organization, broadly speaking. And, and so that was March of 2018. And at which point, John Wood Jr.
It's been 4 years.
Yep. The histories converged. And so that's where the stories meet. And, what eventually leads me here to being with you.
So, why the name change from Better Angels to Braver Angels? Was there like
Mhm.
a process behind that?
Well, yeah. So it was a couple of
I like
things.
Braver Angels, by the way. I don't,
Well,
just
good.
curious.
I'm glad. It actually was my name child. And there are two things that happened. One was, once again, trademark dispute.
Someone didn't like Better Angels.
Yeah, no, somebody with more money than we had was a bit upset about that, and things were ultimately resolved amicably. So it's okay. But we had to step away from the original name, and the name Better Angels is taken from Abraham Lincoln quotation. Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I thought
You
that's what it
know,
was from.
yeah, well, yeah, that's absolutely right. It was, referenced, touching the better angels of our nature
Yep.
in his first inaugural address on the eve of the Civil War, right? Trying to sort of stave off the apocalypse that was to come. So, better angels, that's where the original name came from. I advocated for a shift to braver angels for two reasons. One of them practical, being the fact that I thought a similar sounding name would allow us to preserve as much brand recognition as we could, right?
They're
Which I
close.
Right,
I'd assume they're the same.
exactly.
Yeah.
So on that front, it seemed like a sound choice. But also, there is something of a
You know what I prefer?
what's that?
Courageous Angels. No, I'm kidding.
Well, maybe the trademark is available on that one, subsidiary.
Probably. Oh,
But the more substantive reason was, there is a cottage industry of, of nonprofit organizations and foundations committed to depolarization and bridge building work. This field is now, in the last few years, expanded rapidly. Other players
because everyone's
have
freaking out
stepped
about
into
it.
it,
Yeah.
right? And so it's now becoming more sort of firmly formed, and it's maturing. But you've had sort of a cottage, sector for a while doing this kind of work, within which, the value and virtue of empathy has always been foundational.
And this is the thing that
Mhm.
is destroying us, in my opinion,
Mhm.
is that if someone's your ideological enemy,
Mhm.
they're now not just worthless as a human being, they're actually not human or dehumanized.
Mhm.
And so whatever vitriol you direct at them is
Yeah.
somehow now justified.
Right.
Like that's the core problem.
Yeah. Well, it is. It is. And there's so much more we can say about that. But the reason, and owing to that fact, in this sort of sector as it had existed, there's naturally a deep sort of emphasis on the value of empathy in being sort of the spirit that guides bridge building work. And of course, because, in order to really develop a deep relationship of trust with you, if especially if we are tribal, opposites, it's going to be important for me to be able to demonstrate the fact that I can kind of, put myself in your shoes to sort of see things as you see things, to demonstrate the fact that I, have some understanding of who you are, what's important to you, and that I care enough to have that understanding and demonstrate it. So the emphasis on empathy is needed, but it had long been evident to me that to really pursue this work into sort of the heat of America's tribal and political conflicts, which is where it needs to go, it takes more than just being empathetic. You really do need courage. You really do need bravery to be able
Increasingly,
to
unfortunately.
sustain. Well, and for two immediate reasons. One, the most obvious one, is that you try and reach out to people who have uh, been culturally kind of like pitted against you. There's going to be oftentimes a level of distrust towards you, and maybe even a tendency towards being a little bit mean towards you, maybe just on the
Maybe.
basis, just maybe, just on the basis of the fact that you're from the other party. But people in your own party, your own comrades and compatriots, will oftentimes look at you with some degree of suspicion, and maybe even, a sense that you've sold out, on the basis of the fact that you do choose to empathize with people who think differently, because people on each side are, to whatever degree, find themselves committed to the notion that, look, I can't, honor
Break
this
bread with those
person.
people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I
so
can't socialize with these people. I can't keep company with them, because if I do, I'm entertaining fascists. If I do, I'm entertaining people who hate America, right? And if you're doing that and you say you agree with me, but you're friends with them, then I've got a little bit of suspicion towards you too. So bravery wound up being a necessary point of emphasis. And I think that it helped to fortify the message of Braver Angels in a way that has been more empowering for people who have come into our ranks and has had influences on the larger space as well.
I agree, and I like it. And I want to affirm that one of the most noxious beliefs nowadays is that if I sit with you, then somehow I'm vouching for everything you believe in about everything under the sun. And if there's one other statement that's like, oh, you hung out with that person and thus you blessed everything about them. And if they, like the entire thing is like, well, I talk to people in real life all the time, and like, I'm, like I don't agree with everything that that they say, and there's a word that bugs me, and it's funny now because I I'm something of a public figure, and I like have a platform, but this term platforming, it's like, oh, you platformed this person,
right?
You've like given them elevation.
You've given them legitimacy.
It's like you bless this person who is intrinsically illegitimate, and you're just like, like when did sitting with someone somehow like have this kind of weight to it where like you're like, oh, can't talk to that person? And there's so many people now who suffer and struggle with this, where there's like, oh, it's like I can't be seen with this person. Like it's really it's worse than counterproductive.
There are two things. I mean, there are multiple things, but there are two things that I'll mention that are intersecting, I think.
It's like, how the heck are you going to bring people together if you're like not allowed to, have a conversation?
Well,
like,
that's
the whole
thing.
is mind-blowing.
For many folks, there's a limit to the value of bringing people together, right? And so there are two things that I see sort of intersecting here that are most salient. One is the fact that we've come to a point now in American life where, as opposed to times past where Republicans and Democrats, different parties, but there's very little like deep-seated social animosity between the parties, back in the 50s and 60s, there were polls taken, I think at least in the 60s, asking the question, if your child married a Republican or a Democrat, would you care? And it was like 5% of Americans cared. People were but if they married a Catholic, right? I'm not sure what the exact figure is, but it was well upwards of 50%.
Yeah, that was 52,
Yeah, I think it's upwards of 50%. Now nobody cares what religion you are. It's a question of what your political party
politics is the new religion.
Well, yes.
And
so
unfortunately, media tribes, when I was sitting with Arthur Brooks, he said that like media tribes are the new mini religions.
Well, so the difference is...
You're forming a new mini religion.
Well, civic religion is a phrase that has some history to it. And you might be, maybe Eric Liu. Yeah, so there's some Eric talks about. But so the differences between us have extended to being beyond the pale for people in a way to where, it's not just that we have a good faith disagreement about something that's important, but we have I can infer at least that we have a moral disagreement on things that are characterologically determinative of your value as a human being in some respects.
It's
right?
very dark.
And so that makes us not want to interact. But you couple that with the fact that we live in an attention economy within which we are competing for space to be heard. We have more opportunities and more platforms to be heard than ever, but the competition over that, I think, is probably fiercer than it has ever been. And so I think people have a sense of, okay, if you have a platform, holy shit, we all want a platform, especially a platform that people actually come to. And so if you have a platform, you have ethical responsibility, you've got to use that resource, wisely, If you give that resource to somebody who's going to use it to advance systemic racism, just for example, then you are investing in that anti-human project. You're investing in that project of hate. And so, the intensity of sort of the competition within the kind of, information and attention economy meets this moral paranoia. And I don't say moral paranoia to be dismissive of it because, look, I get it. I mean, people have deeply felt reasons for not wanting to elevate, Milo Yiannopoulos or whoever it is you're you're talking about. Oh, I guess we've all forgotten about Milo at this point.
That was a fine example. I got it.
Yeah, right. But it's created this context in which we need to now make the case for why it is utterly imperative, not just for the survival of democracy, but also for the advancement, to put in the racial justice context, of a larger project of equity and equality and social justice in American life, to be able to engage our neighbors.
Yes.
Right? In constructive discourse. We have to make that case anew now in 2022.
Yeah, that's the case I'm making as well, man. I think a lot of people know this about me, but like I think that we need to make big changes.
Yeah.
I don't think the status quo is working. But I also don't think that our current structures are actually conducive to major changes. And so you have to try and shift those structures. In order to shift those structures, you need to build a coalition of people that might not agree on a lot of stuff, but can agree that this situation is not working, that we're getting more and more polarized, that we're turning on each other in various ways. We are in danger, in my view, of falling into widespread political violence over the next number of months, let's say. I mean, I see it too, how these things have interlinked in a way, but I think that they're, again, corrosive and keeping us from solving the real problems. Like there's this multi-billion-dollar set of incentives to inflame and anger us in our own kind of echo chambers. Right. And then there's you and me and some other people who we wish we had billions of dollars that we could, but put to work in various ways. So Bravery Angels, I know, is growing. You're saying that the space itself is getting more resources and attention, which is wholly appropriate. What is upcoming for you? First, you share my concern level about what may be around the corner for us in this country. And second, what are you working on? What are you excited about with Bravery Angels? And also, if someone is inclined to participate in or help what I think is a tremendous organization, how can they do so?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for those questions. First of all, yes, I mean, I do share your assessment, honestly, Andrew. I mean, look, we've already seen political violence.
Sure.
January 6th, but also the summer of 2020 and so forth,
And also, after January 6th, there were dozens of Republicans who were ready to vote to impeach Trump or investigate what happened or whatnot. They all got death threats, and most all of them backed down.
Yeah.
So when you talk about political violence, I'm going to suggest that constituents threatening their representatives' families and whatnot, should be classified in that category, and it's completely having an effect. And we're not paying enough attention to the Peter Myers and the Adam Kinzingers and the Liz Cheneys who tried to buck the trend and said, look, I think this is right, because they have had personal threats against them in serious ways.
It takes serious courage to take the stands that they've taken, and if you're a Republican, listening to us who supports, Donald Trump, you might disagree with the stance that they've taken, but recognize the fact that these are, I think, sincere folks. They are coming from a place of courage.
They're principled. How is it that taking that stand, I mean, it's clearly from a place of principle, because it's not serving your interests. It's not serving your interests politically or personally.
No, it's not. I mean, their future in the Republican Party, in terms of any greater influence, is done, at least with respect to the party.
Why we need a third party, man? All right, continue.
Stands, right? There you go. But but I share your assessment. So in terms of what's coming up for Braver Angels, look, this is a key year, and these next few years.
Yep.
I mean, listen, man, we are in a moment in American life right now where you have widespread distrust of the institutions generally, but of the
Yep.
electoral process in particular.
Yep.
There's actually a way in which, of course, it manifests on the left in terms of, believing that our structures are geared towards voter suppression and so forth. And there are definitely good faith arguments to be had, over the way in which the system needs to be reformed. But on the right, the belief that, shit is just flat out stolen fraudulently, this leads to a circumstance in which if people both believe that that is true and also believe that there is not sufficient goodwill within our institutions and our body politic to be able to hear out each other's concerns and lead towards intelligent reforms of the system that may allow us to reestablish trust, then what option will people see for themselves other than resorting to the most extreme behavior that they can, tolerate in order to make their voices heard, or otherwise just find ways to kind of divorce themselves from larger society, which, is
It
part of
also
what.
feeds into the fact that there are many, many men in particular who've been displaced economically and socially.
Yes, it does.
And so you have a lot of dry tinder.
That's right. That's right. Because the contempt is not just for the electoral process. It's for every institution in major institution in society. Yes, it's for the presidency. It's for Congress. It's for the electoral system. It's for the courts, but it's also for the financial system. It's for Hollywood and the media in the media industry. It's for the education system, right?
Yeah.
Believing that our professors are just there to indoctrinate our students and so forth. And again, you go, you look on the left and there's a sense that all of this is just sort of white supremacist architecture anyway, right? And so, but with respect to the specific question of our confidence in the electoral system, all of these things are coming to a head, and that's really coming to a head because we have a date with that question, 2022 midterms, but then presidential election in 2024, where we are going to vote. There's going to be a shift in power, or, rearranging of power, following that. And then there's going to be the question of, do we believe that it is legitimate? Donald Trump is still here. Donald Trump has not given an inch, in terms of what he believes or says he believes was the case about, the 2020 election. And you do have larger forces that are pushing that narrative forward, right? Okay, so Braver Angels in upcoming weeks, but I think it's okay for me to share this with you here. We are launching an initiative. You'll see the details of it roll out. This is going to be in partnership with a significant national partner and various different organizations to basically seed Braver Angels workshops across the country. We have programming that is unfolding in Congress now, working with the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress. That's right. But these programs are meant to be seated in state houses and local governments and potentially even school boards across America, mobilizing our national organizing infrastructure, but joining hands with various other partners to push things forward. And, the only reason I'm not saying more about it is because
I got to leave some for the press announcement.
Yeah, exactly. Don't want to step in front of our PR. It's
very
folks,
exciting, though.
Right? It is, and see the power of this isn't just in the context of planting workshops in local governments, because people will come up to us and they'll say, okay, well, I can see it being a good thing that you have city councilmen or state assembly persons engaging in a red-blue workshop, and they are impactful, even for elected officials. But people will make the case that there's a difference between an elected official, between a regular, Joe or Jane in the neighborhood whose chief issue with polarization is their inability to hang out with each other, versus state legislators who are institutionally embedded, who have surrounding structural interests. But the power of this initiative isn't just in terms of seeding the workshops. It's also owing to mobilizing a larger community of Americans to engage their elected officials and engage each other in an actionable pathway towards pushing their elected officials to model the culture that they themselves are calling for and organizing around as communities of constituents. And so you don't just have a methodology that's going to be participated in, but you have the rallying of voters, right? Saying, this is the kind of politics we want to see. This is the kind of change, we want to see made manifest. And in the course of doing, you exercise people's organizational muscles to work alongside of each other, right? So look, I mean, we're going to be starting, relatively small here. I mean, we're going to be piloting in particular areas, seeing what we learn and scaling out. But, over the course of not just this year, but the few years to come, especially as we get into 2024, the serious goal here is to be able to mobilize a significant enough portion of America. And on a percentage basis, I don't think it has to be all that
It
high
does not need to be
at
that high
all.
on a
I
percentage
mean,
basis now.
you can fall well short of 1% of voters and make an amazing impact on, the culture and the flow of, politics in our society. But the idea is to get to the point at which we achieve a critical mass that's able to be impactful, building up braver angels, reach and structure and apparatus, but also working with partners from across the spectrum as well, right? And I can't say this clearly enough, man. What we do is for folks who are, social justice activists with Black Lives Matter and Trump supporting populists, on the right. The question isn't what you believe politically. The question is, are you willing to see the humanity in your fellow American, right? Are
Amen.
you willing to acknowledge and treat that person with dignity? If so, you got a seat at our table, and you can join us as a member and potentially a volunteer if you want to get your hands dirty at braverangels.org.
Well, thank you, John Wood Jr., for being a very effective ambassador for a very, very important organization that I love. Everyone I've met from Braver Angels has been really human, empathetic, patriotic, principled, and brave. And I cannot wait to do everything we can to support you and your work.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to our mutual friend Silas Kulkarni, who's been a tremendous leader within Braver Angels and who's really been a tremendous advocate within our larger community for the Forward Party and for the movement that obviously you've been inspiring Americans with for some time now. And I'm just grateful that we've been able to make this connection and, look forward to
Forward
finding ways
Party
to work
plus
together
Braver
in the
Angels equals maybe democracy survives. Maybe we continue to appreciate each other's common humanity, even if we don't agree on everything.
And set the paradigm for democracy that may be better than it's ever been.
Yeah. I mean, heck, let's not settle for, survival.
That's right.
Let's shoot for flourishing.
There you go. There you go.
John, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brother Andrew. Appreciate you.